I'm here today to talk about basically achieving rapid energy demand reduction in the UK and its role in the climate crisis. Obviously, I don't know if everyone knows, but now actually we're not meant to say climate change anymore, according to The Guardian. The Guardian's updated it where they think climate change doesn't give us a serious enough sense of the scale of the challenge. So now we've been told to call it a climate crisis, and I'll see how it goes with using that terminology, but may slip into the old one. Okay, I thought I'd briefly describe who I am and the current research. So for about 20 years, I've felt it was strong enough to say that I've pioneered some of the consumption-based accounting approaches in the UK, which measure the footprint from a different perspective, and I'll quickly run through that at the beginning as a sort of background to the work that we've done. And in essence, linking emissions to consumption patterns. And increasingly, as well as monitoring and measuring our emissions, we've increasingly moved into understanding what it would mean to reduce our emissions through changing our consumption, all with a focus on achieving this from a greenhouse gas perspective. At the moment, historically, I was a co-director of the UK Energy Research Centre and also director of CMAP, which was the Centre for Industrial Energy Materials and Products, which the Research Council set up as one of its energy demand centres. Those energy demand centres are finished, and they now are formed under one centre, which is CREDS. And I've even gone with CREDS branding today, as opposed to University of Leeds, to sort of give it that profile. And CREDS is a centre for research into energy demand solutions. And it's a £19 million initiative, and it is attempting to bring together lots of the key researchers in energy demand in the UK to understand how we could achieve rapid reductions in energy demand. We're also a provider to the UK government for some of their headline indicators, which we provide annually to them. So we provide them with their consumption-based greenhouse gas accounts as part of a contract we have with DEFRA, and we now also provide them with all their material flow and material intensity accounts as well. And then we've worked closely with a number of government departments. So we work closely with BEIS in shaping their material efficiency and industrial policy, and also recently with the Committee on Climate Change with their Net Zero report. So I'm going to very briefly start with consumption-based accounting, and I know lots of people will know this, so I will go reasonably quickly, but I think this frames where we come from in terms of energy demand reduction. As I'm sure most people know, we account for our greenhouse gas emissions from a territorial perspective, and that is how countries have to report to the UN and the official way of reporting. And that, in essence, counts up all the emissions which occur inside the UK, and they are allocated to the UK. And they have reduced significantly. Well, no, they haven't. They've reduced at a reasonable rate over time. In the last 20 years, have gone down, or the CO2 has gone down by about 1% a year. But we also calculate this from a consumption perspective, which considers basically the production minus the exports and all the embodied emissions added on into the imports. Now, it won't surprise you, the UK is a net importer of emissions. As we've shifted more and more to a service-based economy, what we've found is that we are then importing more and more of the energy-intensive sectors to feed the service sector, to feed the economy as a whole. And therefore, from this perspective, there has only been about a 6% reduction in emissions from a consumption perspective over that time period. All this should be framed, obviously depending what the level of reduction should be is clearly open for debate, depending on how much you think the UK should take of the global slice. But if we just to do a very simple analysis and assume that our emissions would be net zero by 2050, which is in line with the current Committee on Climate Change report, and they propose that that is in line with our international obligations under the Paris Agreement to reach international targets, then that would be a linear reduction around 8% a year. But you could argue that that reduction should be even higher if the UK was to take less of the global chunk of remaining emissions to stay within 1.5 degrees. But in reality, from a consumption perspective, we are reducing our emissions by about 0.25% over the last 20 years, when we need a scale of reduction of around 8% a year. Now, we think it's important to account for the consumption-based emissions for a number of reasons, but obviously most importantly that we wouldn't want to be reducing our emissions in the UK, but carrying on importing all our products and causing the emissions elsewhere. Because what we clearly know about climate change is it doesn't really matter where the emissions occur, it's the total amount that links to the temperature, and therefore it is our total emissions which has the effect on climate. And in that respect, consumption-based emissions gives us that full picture. We also wouldn't want to, I suppose, have perverse policies which reduced emissions in the UK but increase them elsewhere. An example of that could be biofuels, if done incorrectly, where it may reduce, let's say, oil, gas use in the UK, but if we import those biofuels, they potentially could have a higher carbon intensity than fossil fuels, such as gas. And a few studies have shown that that is the case in some ways of producing biofuels. Next, and the next reason we think is really important is that if we only look at it from a production perspective, we are limiting the amount of mitigation options which are available to us, because when we account for them, the emission reduction doesn't happen inside the UK, so therefore it looks less favourable from a policy perspective. Whereas if you go from a consumption perspective, then that policy then becomes considerably more effective at reducing emissions. So we might say, oh, that policy looks really effective, cheap, and could be implemented in a short time period, but it reduces emissions outside the UK, so we're not interested. And I've basically been told that on a number of occasions by people in BEIS. So just to give you an understanding, we're mainly importing materials. That is what the increased embodied emissions is, because in essence materials are carriers of embodied energy. And here was our analysis from 97 up to 2015. It's cut off the graph for some reason, which is trying to do a decomposition analysis to understand why our footprint changed in terms of industry in the UK over that time period. And in this, if all these other factors had stayed the same, then the emissions from industry in the UK would have increased because our level of demand for goods and services from industry increased over that time period. But we did become more efficient at producing them, and therefore the increase of about 12,000 kilotons of oil equivalent, we nearly, I suppose, negated those that energy use through improvements in efficiency. Or you could be the other way around, that improvements in efficiency failed to mitigate for the increase in energy demand through our increased demand. But also added to that was, this was the offshoring of industry over that time period, responsible for our 8,000 kilotons of oil equivalent in terms of energy. Now, all of that was basically taken off the UK's accounts, but we are still, in essence, consuming and importing those products. So it's been a major player in reducing our emissions over that time period. So I want to move quickly from the numbers onto the applications of this, and I explain this using a Sankey diagram. So here we have the UK's energy demand broken down by 5 different categories. I recognise that electricity could be allocated to those other ones, and there's lots of different ways that we could split it, but this is how it's split in this particular diagram. And that's the UK's energy demand in 2015. And what we do with our multi-regional input-output model is understand how that energy flows through the UK economy. So how that energy is then consumed by intermediate demand here, so manufacturing, and then how all those products end up delivering energy demand services to households. So these households at this end. So we know, for example, for the households to the service of shelter to be delivered, so that would be the energy use in the home, that would be the building of the house, and so on, requires energy inputs from every other sector indirectly. Whether it be indirect, so it might flow from services here into industry here to shelter here. So that allows us, well, I'll show you what that allows us to do in a second. Added to that then is what we understand what is imported in terms of intermediate demand into UK industry. So therefore that is the embodied energy in materials and products brought into UK manufacturing and industry and then turned into another product. So it could be a steel, which a finished steel product that comes into the car manufacturing sector, which is turned into a car and then delivers the services of transport here for mobility. But also we understand what's imported in terms of final products to households directly. So we know that if it was I'll stick with the example of a car then, it'd be a completely finished car being imported and directly purchased by a household. And finally, we also know out of all the sectors what's exported. Now, this model sits over a 20-year time series. We can break this down into 40 different countries. We can break this down into 106 different product categories, but I've aggregated it, obviously. But it gives us a lot of depth and understanding. And I'm just going to go through a few examples that we think this supply chain approach of understanding emissions helps in terms of identifying mitigation options. So, for example, we could focus, which the UK government predominantly does as part of its industry energy efficiency strategy, to try and improve the energy efficiency of industry in the UK. And this would be here. But such a policy would ignore all of the emissions or energy, as this example is, of all imported products. Because if we are just working at this end, i.e. UK industry, we are ignoring the efficiency of industry of all products coming into the UK, albeit flowing through to other manufacturing to produce into a product or as a final product to households. So we also, in our CREDS project, don't want to ignore the fact that there are some energy efficiency improvements here. So we have now just finished a complete analysis of all the remaining efficiency options in both the energy and non-energy intensive sectors inside the UK, identifying savings between 15 and 20% in emissions in energy efficiency, which is a lot more adventurous than they're applying. But it's still fairly small, and one of the reasons is that we are already quite efficient in terms of our energy intensive sectors. Energy costs are a high proportion of their costs, roughly a third to produce steel, for example, and therefore it won't surprise you that they're already running at a reasonably efficient rate. But there are some options left here, and such an analysis obviously could be done without any of this complexity. But what it does do is recognise that if we just concentrate on the efficiency of this bit, we are not in any way understanding how manufacturing could change, how households could change, and how we might affect imports. So in addition to that, we are also then looking at how industry or manufacturing and construction function in the system to reduce energy demand. Now, energy demand clearly doesn't just have to be reduced through increasing the efficiency of industry. It could also be done by changing the way that the construction sector functions. Now, the majority of the steel, cement and so on goes into construction. It is our largest user, not surprisingly, of energy-intensive materials. So here, with the Green Building Council, we are now constructing scenarios on what net zero looks like, not just from the operational energy used in a house, but the whole embodied lifetime of houses. And that's everything from material substitution in the construction to questioning the rates of demand and growth and whether we need them, the efficiency by which we could use buildings both domestically and also commercially, as well as looking at energy efficiency options within those sectors. So in essence, it allows us to affect the level of growth and demand in capital, be it large infrastructure or with housing, and it also allows us to think how they could deliver their final product more efficiently. Within the whole same framework then, we can also then think about how households can consume differently to change either to consume differently, which I might call more efficient consumption, or to consume less, i.e. consuming less, In that respect, we have a number of options here, and I'll give an example of the work which we did with Kate, now at Manchester University, used to be with us at Leeds, of how we've gone about that in a minute. But my final point here is that by having this consistent framework, I think it places in context our understanding of what efficiency in terms of the energy system can do, in what we can do in terms of changing the way supply chains work, and also reminding us that changing consumption patterns can be a useful vehicle for energy demand. And I've now got examples of each of those as I move through. But one of the key points I want to make is the ability, the importance of, when we're thinking of energy demand, of moving away from it being seen as an energy efficiency agenda. And I'm going to demonstrate that with a study which we haven't published yet, but Anne Owen, who works with me at Leeds, has just produced. And so again, it's a decomposition analysis. So I probably should have said what that is in essence. In essence, it decomposes the individual variables to show what emissions would have been if just that particular variable played out and the others stayed the same. Yeah.
What's insurance? How does that bring this one?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, it's quite small. We pulled that one out, but I'd usually put it in something else because it's quite small, but particular. That's providing insurance to households.
And that uses?
It has a whole supply chain attached to it. Yes, it does. Because think about all the replacement of all the materials and products in households, sure. But also the insurance company itself and all the energy it would use and all its computers and its whole system as part of it. Yeah, no, it's fine. It's interesting actually because we got contacted actually by a very large insurance company who wanted us to work out their impacts, and they worked out that they were the biggest purchaser of carpets in the whole of the UK. And that's when and before that, I'd have asked exactly the same question, thinking, why is insurance so significant? But in essence, it's encompassing all of those material products. And yeah, no worries at all. In this decomposition, so here is what happened to our consumption-based emissions in the UK over the last 20 years. And we've decomposed them to show what would have happened to the emissions. So the blue line is our total demand, and you notice the rapid reduction in line with the recession here. But our emissions would still be higher because our demand is higher over that time period. Lots of people might say that's a good thing. Of course it's good the emissions dropped by about 8% in 1 year. But at the same time, it also reminds us how closely decoupled the economy and our level of our emissions are together. So one goes up, the other goes down. But the key one I want to highlight here is to do with the efficiency, which is this one here. And our efficiency has successfully brought down our emissions roughly by the same amount on that end date as have the growth in demand. Now, if we were to just pursue an efficiency agenda, i.e. producing, having the same amount of output, or the service output, but more efficiently through technological improvements, there are two issues, I think, that are a major problem here. One, we are suggesting that there is an inherent link between this efficiency and this drive in economic growth. And I've got a slide on that in a minute. And secondly, if you just pursue efficiency, you are not thinking about how we will change our levels of energy service demands. How will we change the actual demand that we want in terms of energy services? And therefore, we are ignoring the fact that we will run out of efficiency options in the end, but we will potentially not run out of our ability to continue growing our energy services. So we're arguing, and now we're doing an analysis, and I put this here as an example as opposed to everyone to read, and I've also done it so that when it's sent round after, people can look at it in more depth. But along with Felix Kreutzig and others in the past, it clearly identifies that for us to address energy demand, not only must we address efficiency to improve, as he calls it, we must also consider avoid and shift as part of that agenda. And I think one of the most important things for CREDS as a centre is that we are not, in essence, just thinking of this as an efficiency problem. We need to avoid passenger kilometres. We need to avoid our need for heat, lighting. We need to change our calorific intake So just as an example, the average person in the UK consumes 3,440 calories a day. We need around 2,400 on average. That's a major excessive amount of consumption. Goods and services, we need to actually affect and change and avoid the consumption of the most energy intensive materials. From a shift perspective, we need to shift potentially, this is obvious, I know some of it, from motorized vehicles to walking, cycling, from shelter, a shift to less energy intensive appliances, and the list goes on and on and on. And I've now got examples about how we can do that. But just to further emphasize the point that if we just go for the improved function, that we might be in serious trouble. This was a paper which we published 2 months ago, where we developed a macroeconometric model which tries to link the role that technical improvements in energy efficiency have made to economic growth over the last 40 years in the UK. It's the first time it's been done to this level of detail. Beforehand, energy demand is often seen as exogenous or outside of the economy. And if you think of the way that one of the key models which is used by the UK government for its modelling, which is UK Times, what it does is it takes energy demand from elsewhere, exogenous to the model, it puts that in, and then it just works out the technologies that are needed to deliver that. There is very little feedback to actually reduce the energy demand. So what we have here, the black line's a bit hidden. I think I need to make it stronger because it's very close to the yellow line. The black line is the level of GDP growth that we have seen over the UK, in the UK over this time period. Now, the only one I want to point out clearly here, due to time constraints, I'll do two actually, number 1 and number 5. Number 5 is capital investment, and the grey line. And this is what would have happened to economic growth in the UK if we hadn't have developed our capital investment any more than we did in 1971. It would have had a major effect on economic growth, reducing it quite significantly. I don't know the percentage off the top of my head, but what would that be? It's about 25% would be my guess. Yes, it is about 25%, yeah. And the other one to highlight then is energy. And from this, we'd established that if we hadn't have had all the energy efficiency improvements in industry over that time period, then economic growth could have been about 20% lower than it was today over that time period. It has played a major role in driving economic growth over that time period. And this makes sense from a kind of anecdotal perspective. If you imagine an industry is able to get a 20% reduction in its energy input, and that is a major cost to it, the factory itself doesn't therefore say, I can now reduce my demand by my output by 20% because when that profit margin is absolutely fine for me. That is not how the system works, as we all know. It will sit there and it will be able to produce more and more. It will drive innovation, it will drive down costs, it will increase production, and that's the whole idea of the whole system. That's what it's all about, productivity. And we're suggesting that energy efficiency productivities have not reduced energy demand over the last 40 years, they've increased it. But those improvements are mainly in the industry. We find it different for households. For households, the effect is not so great because households don't act as such perfect economic rational actors as industry do. Not that industry are perfect by any means, but households do not try and optimize their economic output. Therefore, they are not converting that productivity into increased consumption to the same rate as industry. Now, I know that's a lot, but the take-home message is an efficiency agenda in itself potentially could act to increase energy demand and not reduce it. So does that mean that we shouldn't have any energy efficiency at all? And my immediate answer to that is no, because the problem is not energy efficiency. The problem is that we have no cap in the system. So therefore, the system can keep on growing. If we had a cap, then all these rebound effects would become positive, because then you'd be able to say, we need to get as maximum social good, however you wish to measure that, out of each unit of energy. And therefore, any efficiency gains that we make allow us to have more outputs of social goods, energy services, whatever you might wish to call it, per unit of energy. But unless we cap the system, it will continue growing and we will lose the benefits of energy efficiency. Yeah?
John, you're capping energy use.
Oh, that's my final slide. Can I say, don't be, you'll blow it. Yeah. That's the final discussion, exactly. Does the cap just need to be in emissions or does it need to be in energy as well? Now, I'll come back to that, yeah. Yeah.
All of this is to do with like CO2 emissions and like barrels of oil used, but is there anything you're taking into account like actual materials used and sourced?
This is an energy analysis. We've done materials separately as well, but we haven't built materials into the econometric model to be able to do this yet. But we have just produced a new indicator for DEFRA, which is the carbon intensity of materials, and we've calculated that for them for a 20-year period. And it generally shows that it's starting to increase again, actually, even though it dipped for many years. So we're trying to combine the two, but we haven't built materials as a driver of growth into the model at this stage. But yeah, sure.
On the energy efficiency increasing overall energy demand in the industrial sector, is there any data on the impact that has on imports? So are we producing more here and then importing less, or is that just increasing consumption, do you think?
I don't totally know because we haven't got imports in this analysis, so I don't know. My suggestion is it's increasing consumption, but we could get a more extreme picture when we apply a consumption-based approach. To be able to, econometric models are very complicated. So in essence, the aim of them is to understand how each independent variable interacts with every other variable. So it has 72 different variables interacting with each other, and we haven't got trade in it yet. But that's on the list, so I can't completely answer that question. Yeah. Okay, so I just wanted to then look about, so I wanted then just to go a global picture for 2 slides, and then I'll move on back to the UK again. But we were interested then about what assumptions were sat behind all of the IPCC's 1.5 degree main scenarios that are in the report in terms of what they say will happen in terms of improvement in energy intensity over these different time periods. And this is what's happened in terms of global energy intensity improvements each year. So that's the reality. And this is what the scenarios are all assuming will happen. And when I look through them all, I'm finding it very difficult to find any detail on why suddenly, when we were around 1% a year improvements, we are suddenly going to be achieving 4% in energy intensity improvements each year. And I feel that what happens here is they are simply drawing on some neoclassical economic thinking of how the economy interacts with energy, and they are drawing lines and coming up with the fact that in reality they think that those improvements are going to happen, and there is no sense or connection about how the economic growth which they have in all of their forecasts potentially could affect those energy intensity and drive energy demand. And this is highlighted then further when I looked at what their assumptions were about what would happen in terms of energy demand overall over that time period in all the IPCC scenarios. And again, lots of them are projecting potentially growth which has nothing to do with the historical relationship from a global level between energy and economy. So here we have economy and energy. Here is roughly an historical pattern where we have, and here is their assumptions on what happens to that. And I'm really concerned that we don't have some sound empirical evidence to underpin the energy demand projections that sit behind all of these scenarios, and that it's predominantly thinking of this as an energy intensity problem. Back to the UK, one of the key points that we get from this is that we shouldn't just see energy demand then as an issue in terms of, let's say, retrofitting houses, which is clearly a very important and obvious thing to do. It has to be a broader agenda and understand how energy is used across the whole economy and how energy and materials interact. So this is a study which Kate led on, sitting up there, hi Kate, where we tried to understand how resource efficiency could reduce energy demand. And we came up with a range of strategies at varying different levels of ambition. But we were suggesting that in terms of resource efficiency, it could potentially have greater reduction than the whole of industrial energy efficiency programme that the government currently has in place. Yeah, sure. Do you have a question? Sorry, yeah, sure. So in essence, we think that this is a seriously missed opportunity. And these could be anything from construction, from material substitution to lightweighting of buildings, through to issues of transport, of car sharing, of promotion of car clubs to try and get efficiency in use. I'm sure lots of you know the car sits there for 90–95% of the time without being used. It has an occupancy rate well below half. It's incredibly inefficient and expensive. And we looked at how that would affect material use and so on. We looked at reducing food waste and changing, and we've also looked historically at changing diets and so on and so on. And here are the current government policies in blue. And here was what we thought under different carbon budget periods a progressive resource efficiency strategy could achieve. So if we start to look at energy demand through the whole economy, we start to think that we find options which we hadn't given enough attention to before. And this is kind of my example of that. And this is not the only one. Yeah. It also, the modelling approach that we use allows us to think about the distributional problems that are associated with it. And this was some work which we finished last year for UKirk, and I've put all of the references and links at the end to everything. And what we did in this analysis, we looked at the energy demand of different households in the UK, but not just their direct energy, their gas and so on, the embodied energy in every single item of expenditure. And we've broken that down by income groups. So here's your 10% highest income group, and here's your lowest income group. I should say these are even more extreme in terms of this group's more extreme in terms of greenhouse gas emissions because there's a higher carbon intensity in the areas that they are consuming. But for now, this is an energy analysis. And what you can clearly see is that lower income groups, potentially most of their energy demand is in home heating and power. So in essence, they're using their income to provide them with heat and power in the home. That's in the home. And their travel is hardly anything. But then we look at the travel of potentially the highest income group, and it's absolutely enormous. And this is predominantly aviation. So these are your aviation groups up here. These are the groups that fly regularly. These are the groups that hardly ever fly, and these are the groups that fly once, twice a year. That's roughly how it goes. And what's interesting is that when we've gone and placed we've used an economic measure to try and affect our emissions and to pay for some of the renewable subsidies in the UK, we've placed it on home heat and power. We've placed the energy costs on that. So therefore, we place the energy costs on the energy part, which the low-income groups use as a very high proportion of their total energy demand, and then we offer subsidised areas of consumption for the areas that are mainly consumed by the high-income groups, aviation being a very good example of that. So in reality, this kind of breakdown means that we could potentially look at the distributional impacts of every single policy at the beginning or end of its supply chain.
Sorry, can I
Yeah, sure.
why you said why you're categorising aviation as being subsidised?
Okay, potentially it doesn't face the same taxation regime as, as road transport would, yeah. Okay, so I thought, so one of the things we want to do at CREDS is there to create a kind of radical demand reduction narrative around what energy demand could do for a net zero future in the UK. So I decided to read the Committee on Climate Change technical report of 304 pages on the train, and I didn't get that far, but I did manage to pick out some of the key things it said on energy demand, but I will put a disclaimer that I might have missed some, but I don't think I did, because I did a search for the word demand, and I pulled out some of the key points from the report last week by the committee, And this is what they say in terms of how the role of energy demand will be in these different sectors. So over the next 30 years, the most ambitious we could be for road transport is a 10% shift away from car to public transport, cycling and walking. We will increase air by 50% over that time period. We will have improvement efficiencies of 1.4% a year, which I don't think they can get for a number of reasons, because we've only achieved that historically, but we've achieved lots of the technical energy efficiency improvements already in aviation, and also the last 5-year improvements have been gained more from increasing the number of people on the plane. And as much as Ryanair will try, you can only cram a certain number of people into a plane. Buildings, they would have a 21% reduction through energy efficiency, and non-residual, sorry. I had residual emissions in my head. Non-residential, 25% reduction. Industry would be a 13% reduction through energy efficiency, and then it incorporated all of the resource efficiency strategies, which we worked on. Food would be a 15% reduction in energy demand through food waste and dietary shifts, and the dietary shift part was a 20% reduction in meat. And electricity would be about a 20% reduction. Now, there may be more in there. It's not easy. They haven't got one nice diagram which shows what energy demand will be. But that's my initial take on it. And then I thought, I was quite appalled by it, because if that's what we can do over 30 years when we have a climate crisis on our hands, and the best we could do is explore a shift over a 30-year period of 20% reduction in meat, when between 2015 and 2016 we had a 4% reduction in meat, and added to road travel, that this shift is actually, to some extent, is happening in some areas, and considering that potentially it's the top 30–40% of the UK's high-income people that do this, and we're going to let them potentially double their use. And then added to that, sorry, I'm going on a high horse a bit here, but added to that, we have gone ahead and we will say that we will suddenly find 50–60 million tonnes of carbon capture and storage, which we haven't even invented properly yet at scale, and we will put the reliance on that over the strategies that we all know to avoid shift and improve energy demand, I think is disgraceful. So I think CREDS needs to quite urgently deal with this as an energy demand centre. So what we're doing then, and this will hopefully be done within the next 3–4 months now, is we've taken, this is the IPCC's scenarios for 1.5 degrees, and they have 4 illustrative pathways, P1, 2, 3 and 4, and how we can achieve that reduction over time. And as you can see, they have varying different levels of faith in negative emission technologies. But number 1 is the interesting one. This comes from Arnold Grubler's paper in Nature Energy, which is a radical low energy demand for the world. But it doesn't sit at a national level. And I think we need to be able to articulate that scale of reduction at a national level, because that's where the policies happen. And that's where we need to implement all of these energy demand strategies. So we've teamed up with Charlie Wilson and Arnold Grubler to translate this and build this for this kind of scenario for the UK. And what we've done is we have an expert on each of the areas, and we in essence are pushing it as far as we can to understand what energy demand could mean in terms of avoid, shift and improve of all of these particular energy services, using Felix Kreutzig's paper in Nature Energy as a framework and structure. We are then calculating what the 1.5 budgets look like for the UK, a translation of that. Now, I agree, lots of this is up for debate, but I've nearly run out of time. Then using an integrated assessment model to understand how that would translate into a complete scenario on both the demand and the supply side. Then establishing a framework for the policies to deliver on that, and then using the econometric models to try and understand what the wider social and economic implications will be of an energy demand scenario which happens over the next 10 to 15 years. And so that's our next step. I know lots of people have done lots of different bits on all of these, but I feel it's time to bring it together in a more coherent way to give us a stronger statement and to overcome, I think, this inertia, both in government but also in their independent advisors who potentially are not, for some reason, identifying the full potential of energy demand. So just to conclude, it's my last slide. I don't think we should be using the word energy efficiency to describe energy demand. They are different things. They're not substitutable terms, and I think it's really important that that is recognised more and we pull people up on it. Even though our study had a go, I still would articulate that we have a poor understanding of how energy and economy interact with each other in the future. We've gone some way to try and address that, but we need to know considerably more. We need to broaden our policy scope and not see energy as just this direct service which is provided, but have a broader sense of how it interacts with the economy. And this, I think, means that we need to be able to develop a coherent narrative on what a low energy demand future looks like for the UK. It reminds me very quickly that when the CCC launched their report, I can't remember if he said it there or later on, but it was reported to me that John Gummer, the head of the chair of it, said, well, we could have gone further on energy demand, but I'm not living in a cold home and I'm basically not eating crap food. And if that's the perception of the chair, the Committee on Climate Change, that a low energy demand future means that we have to live in a cold home, and that it would mean a switch to a diet which isn't palatable to most people, I think we've got some way to go in terms of winning hearts and minds. And we need to be transformative. I think we need to stop using the language of long-term change and think about short-term solutions. And then finally, my point is that I don't think having a target just for emissions is enough, because having a target for emissions, to me, implies that we will be able to adequately find and balance all the solutions from the supply and demand side as a whole. And we're not doing that on the supply side. We are coming up with specific policies and solutions where we want renewables to be at this percentage by this year. And I almost feel that we're having too much faith in the market on the demand side. Because when we look at marginal abatement cost curves, it shows that energy demand is always revenue generating, which is a clue there might be rebound effects. We just leave it to the market and we think it will happen. And my feeling is that we actually need an energy demand target. Otherwise, I think we're leaving too much to wishful thinking about perfect markets finding those solutions. And I think we actually need a target to reduce that over time. Now, the EU does have a target, but it's based on a very high trajectory growth, and then it takes it off that. But it also isn't taken very seriously. And I think the UK government could take a lead and have an energy demand target. There's the information for CREDS, and then you won't be able to see it. Oh, it's coming up randomly. But if the presentation's made available, I've put all the links to them there. So thank you very much. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you very much, John. I think we can take a few
Yeah,
questions.
I had to speed up a bit, sorry.
Start with Jeff and then we'll work back.
I'd just like to thank you for a brilliant talk. I'm not
thank you.
economist, but that really
Sorry if I've over.
No, it's brilliant.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd like to extend it further that Dieter Helm says that we should be looking at the actual demand, and it should be the fact that we should get a tax and somehow get the Chinese to reduce their coal consumption. I mean, would that be an extension of this? We put a tax on more the consumed carbon and then somehow get it to shifting the big players on coal.
Yeah, it's a tricky one because it would need border carbon adjustments is the term, and we've written some papers on this. So in essence, you would place an equivalent tax on imports, but under WTO rules, you can only tax it equivalent to what you are doing in your country. You can't exceed the tax on the import over the export. So therefore, we'd have to apply the same price as we have in the EU ETS to imports, and the price in the EU ETS is almost collapsed. So therefore, we'd be placing a very small tariff. The second problem is that it doesn't come neatly as a nice ton of steel into the UK. It comes embodied in millions of products. And therefore, we're not convinced we have the complexity to do that. And our analysis showed that only about a third of it comes in as steel, and 2/3 is coming in embodied in these products. And then the next problem with it is that at the World Trade Organization, the WTO discussions, China said that they wanted the best available technology assumption to happen on all their exports, which means that they claim that every steel export is done from their best steel factory. So you immediately understand the political scale of the problem. So therefore, so it's not impossible, but a material efficiency strategy where you reduce the steel consumption in construction techniques through material substitution and lightweighting can happen immediately, don't need global international buy-in, and would drastically affect our imports of steel. So it's not a no, but I think there's other things that we could do more immediately. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, a statistic I came across when I was looking at energy in houses and stuff was that the UK was 27th out of 28 countries for energy efficiency. This is about 2 years ago.
Right, sure.
Just ahead of Latvia. I wondered if you could expand upon what that means and what the challenges to the UK.
Yeah, sure. So this isn't directly my field, but I know the housing bit is a major part of that scenario. And Jan Rosenau from Oxford is the one who's doing the numbers on this scenario here, on the shelter part. But his figures are coming in and suggesting that we could potentially halve energy demand of housing over a 20-year period. The Shadow Labour team are proposing retrofit of a scale which has been never heard of before. Millions of households in a very short amount of time. They're suggesting, they're looking very closely at the energy, forgive me if I pronounce it incorrectly, the energy sprung approach, which is the Dutch approach, and so on. So it feels to me like a low-hanging fruit. And that's roughly what they're suggesting in terms of scale of reduction. And they're saying close to zero within 5 years for new homes. Yeah.
Just a quick
I
point.
can't take
Yeah.
a follow-up, but
Sorry.
if you can follow up afterwards. Jonathan here.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I'd just like to ask you, you raised some very good points about the integrated assessment models that IPCC have been using. What's the prospect of this feeding into that, or your understanding about how radically different for the AR6 that IPCC is going to really start adjusting their
Oh no, I think the IAMs control everything. I think they are the driving force, and I don't see how any work which has taken a different modelling approach is ever going to get a proper say in the IPCC reports.
So you don't think for the AR6 they're going to change it anyway?
No, in some ways they've got a specific chapter on consumption. So I think they're broadening the policy and strategy, and they have a stronger sense of there is a stronger representation of social science across the board to try and bring in different perceptions of social practices and change. So I think that's improved, but I think that there is still a major gap in the integrated assessment models are mainly driven by neoclassical thinking, and I don't feel that these more kind of fringe econometric approaches have much of a say, and I don't have that much confidence that they will be featured strongly.
So no doubt.
Okay, I'll get the room there for getting
Yeah.
more questions in. But
Yeah, I'm not overly optimistic is my general
I'll take
feeling.
the orange and then Barrett.
Yeah.
Thanks, Tom.
Yeah.
I had a question about whether some of those cherry-picked from the CCC report demand reduction things have the same quality as the rebound as efficiency measures.
Yeah.
Transport is the most obvious one. Whether the number's 10% or 50% doesn't really matter. But you know, if you, as you said, owning a car is really expensive. What happens to all that money if somebody gets rid of their car because they start cycling water? So do you have any way of thinking of how serious a problem is that, and whether you need to feed that in, or
Yeah, the only
which
way.
bits of that are more susceptible to that sort of dynamic? Or?
Yeah, sure. So the only way I was going to do it, and I hadn't done this yet, but I was just thinking about it on the train, and that was we could rank these, I'm in the middle of dropping an email to the CCC, who are very open and to share this. It sounds like I didn't like them, but I do actually. They're really nice people, and they are actually doing a really good job. But I feel that they're doing a slight pseudoscience kind of manoeuvre, which I'd like to see them do less of. But overall, though, what I was thinking you could do is you could rank these by the avoid, improve, shift. And on the improve part, that's the energy efficiency bit. And you could get some sense of the rebound from that in comparison to the others. to get some assessment of what the rebounds might be associated with these in comparison with.
Is the rebound even in the shift, surely, on the transport?
Potentially, yeah. So then I just didn't know how much to. Then it's difficult. How much time do I spend trying to understand the CCC's one? And then how much time do we spend trying to make sure that there's a more radical version available? But we're going to have some go at trying to say what does that mean in reality. But I don't totally know yet how I'll manage that, to be honest. Yeah.
I wondered whether you'd got as far as studying some, because I noticed it's all about demand reduction. But
Yeah.
for example, just the retrofit, if we delivered the 50% reductions that Jan Rosenau's put, you said he put in his figures, then we currently have a national construction skills crisis that is actually stopping the stuff we're trying to build at the moment. As I said to Carly last year when we were trying to look to trajectories for the Greater Manchester plan, how do we grow enough people to do this? At which point, therefore, maybe renewables being pushed out faster along with energy storage that would mean you could push out more renewables would be more cost effective while we grow a workforce
Completely.
to do the demand reduction. Because the same will happen with energy sprong. Energy sprong is still 60,000 quid a unit. And seems to me to be a really, really quite strong argument that you might be better off putting that money into a shed load of, a sea load of offshore wind turbines and PVs, etc. Because I'm still trying to work out, just in the Greater Manchester picture, should we aim at 50% and then top the rest up with renewables, or should we aim at less because we haven't got the people and therefore we're going to have to grow them?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I don't know if I can answer it, but we are thinking later on of how we will link this with the industrial strategy, and we have a particular work programme which will be what does the industrial strategy need to look like to allow this to happen. But we're doing it that way round, where we're creating the scenario first. But potentially you could do it the other way around, couldn't you? Where you could devise the industrial strategy and then see what the energy demand implications of it could be. But my feeling is, though, that I was hoping, and this is going into this is very anecdotal now, but I was hoping that the off-site modular design might actually help part of an industrial strategy to allow specific factories to be located and the skill base to be grown quicker. And also overcome other political problems of disenfranchised communities across the country. Because if you can individually design what needs to happen to a house and then it can be produced elsewhere in one location, that seemed like a more possible practical training programme than trying to have an individual retrofit across that. That's as far as I've got from my personal perspective. I'm thinking about how it might work, but no, I agree. So I feel it has to be locations where basically the government says we will have a retrofit factory here. But yeah, that's beyond my knowledge, but that's just the thoughts I've been having. Yeah.
One more question?
Just in addition, don't quote me on that, but what I know is like this precast concrete for modular design is only like 7% overall compared to in situ. So I'm not sure about the reason behind, but possibly in terms of the transport and things like that would definitely increase the energy efficiency.
Yeah.
The price of that.
Yeah, so on off-site design has been shown to be quite good. So we saw a study which was suggesting sort of about 20% savings in terms of material efficiency through off-site construction. And I'm sure but I've seen other random numbers as well. So,
That's a new build
yeah.
for retrofit.
Yes, that is more of a new build thing, and you can replicate that for retrofit.
But you can't, can you? The building's there.
No, you can, because you can take a complete digital picture of the building, can't you? That's what I'm thinking. Anyway, we'll yeah, great, sorry.
One more question?
Yeah.
I have a great deal of difference with this 2050 figure. This date is just too far in the future.
Yeah.
I think if we
I
had
agree.
a figure of 2030, 2035, that would have far more effect and concentrate people's mind that we actually need to take action on it.
I completely agree, and that's actually I wasn't clear. That's what we're doing. We're only drawing the budget up to 2050 to know the cumulative budget so that we can create budgets up to different time periods. So we would want these actions done by 2030, 2035. Right. Yeah.
Another small point.
Yeah.
I was quite surprised that still in our planning system, there's no consideration to do with climate change and the amount. So for example, my neighbour, who's in a perfectly good 3-bedroom house, has decided to rebuild it. So he's effectively creating a new 2-bedroom house extension, if you like.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Which, according to Mike Berners-Lee, is about 80 tonnes of carbon just in doing that. Apparently.
Yeah. No, that seems about right, actually. Yeah. Yeah. A new build's about that. Yeah.
And there's nothing to say this is a stupid idea because you've already got a perfectly good house.
Yeah. As I suppose that helps in my final line then, which basically says there are so many options on the demand side and they're being ignored. And there's a
conservatories and then put air conditioning unit in.
Yeah.
Make sure it's conditioned.
Yep.
That's allowable.
Yeah.
Okay, can everyone join me in thanking John?
Well, thank you.